Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Irish Rural Link, the next in the series of looking at the future of electricity in Ireland. This is, of course, an initiative that we're very proud to host, working with EirGrid. I think it really is important that we consult, and this is what this is about. It's about consultation. And this regional workshop is the Northwest region. So members of the public, you're extremely welcome to all of this event, because I think what EirGrid are trying to do is to try and get as many people into the discussion as possible. People in rural, urban, young people. So in that endeavor, they have actually used a range of organizations to do this. So this is just one other in that consultation process. So I really thank you, the public and members of Irish Rural Link who have joined in this consultation. The way we operate is, of course, is the agenda, which is there in front of you. I will hand over to James in a moment, but we have guest speakers, which I will talk to you about. Dr. Paul Dean is a senior fellow in clean energy futures at the Environmental Research Institute from UCC. He's authored and co-authored over 120 technical papers on the future of energy. So he is indeed quite an expert, and he's also the author of Ireland's Low Carbon Roadmap 2015. I would also, so you're very welcome, Paul. Robbie Ahern. Robbie is the head of Future Work Networks in EirGrid. Has over 15 years experience in the power industry. Robbie is currently responsible for the delivery of Shaping Our Electricity and the Future Roadmap, envisaging the power system in the future of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Bill Kelly. Bill has been a feature of all our consultations. Welcome back again, Bill. Bill's talk will be very interesting as well, focusing on the training and education of community groups, and I think it is worth listening to in the preparation and presentation of their energy generation projects in the RES network, the RES auction network. So that really will be quite an interesting talk, because, of course, coming from an Irish Rural Link perspective, we do value the communities getting involved in this debate, because I think they can play a much greater role in this. So you yourselves will, using the chat line, will have an opportunity to raise questions and let us know, and these will be answered sometimes by the panelists as they come in, but they will be taken in the questions and answers later on. And of course, you will have an opportunity in the breakout session to have your say as well. So if I may hand over to James, who is going to do an icebreaker, and then he will introduce the speakers after that, and we will get the ball rolling. Thank you very much, James.
Thanks very much, Seamus. If I could ask everyone to pick up their smartphones or just open up a new tab on their laptop in front of them. And we just have a very short question here just to get the ball rolling this morning. As I said, we want to make this morning as interactive as possible. So if you go to slido.com and you insert the code 542596, and you can pick up the question there. Ireland should do everything possible so that by 2030, at least 70% of its electricity comes from renewable energy sources, like wind turbines, solar panels. What do you think of this statement? Do you strongly agree, neither disagree, or agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? And we have some respondents come in. So please, I'd encourage people just to pick that up, and that's for our own analysis as well. I suppose it's important to point out that this morning's webinar feeds into a report the Irish Rural Link will submit to EirGrid on these workshops and the views of people that attended them as well. And I know there's some EirGrid people here, and they'll give you more details on how you can participate in the consultation. So thanks very much for that part, and let's just get us warmed up this morning. Seamus said we've 3 excellent speakers with us this morning. I suppose, first of all, Dr. Paul Dean is going to set the scene on energy in Ireland, what needs to be done, where we are, and where we're going forward. I won't give Paul his full introduction again with all his credentials and that, because James has already mentioned. But I suppose just to acknowledge, I suppose that Paul has been doing many years of research in this area, and I suppose there's no better person to set the scene for us this morning. So Paul, over to you, and I can see that your screen is shared, so thanks very much.
Thanks very much, James. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. Greetings from the southwest to the northwest here, where I'm down here outside Clonakilty. I don't know what it's like up in your part of the country this morning, but we've had 4 amazing days of sunshine the last, the weekend and yesterday. And I've got some bad news here. The rain is just touching down here now as I speak. So if it's probably heading across the country. So, but that's where I'm coming to you from. As James said, I want to speak to you about a very fundamental question, really, about why are we even bothering to try and increase renewable electricity in Ireland? What's the basis? What's the context? And why are we doing all this? So I'll do my best to explain the reasons behind this and present you some information around the choices that we have. First of all, just for your own sake, it's often very helpful to understand where I'm coming from, where we're coming from. I'm a research scientist, and I work with a university, with University College Cork, but I work with a research group down there called MARI. And our funding, most of our funding comes from Science Foundation Ireland. And we think about the future. We think a lot about the future of energy, how we will heat our homes, how we will fuel our cars, how we will use our land, and of course, how we will generate electricity. And within our colleagues, we have about, MARI is unusual as a research institute because it kind of spans most universities right across Ireland. So, and we have different elements that overlap. We have people thinking about climate action, how to drive climate action. We have people thinking about the energy transitions and the energy systems. And we actually do a lot of work on the oceans as well, actually, about using our oceans for energy and using our oceans for clean and sustainable ways. So they're kind of our motivations. But I suppose what's at the heart of a lot of our stuff is actually decarbonization and sustainability and just transitions. That's kind of the core elements that we think about. And then, of course, we work with lots of different people and groups right across the country. Myself, I do a lot of work here with the Irish government in terms of understanding the choices around energy policy and climate policy. I have colleagues who work a lot with different community groups right across Ireland, friends working down in, for example, not too far away from here, the Dingle Community Project. And also we do a lot with industry as well, very large utilities, in understanding their options to make them greener, more sustainable, and cleaner. And that's what we're kind of, that's where I'm coming from in terms of my work and in terms of my research. And of course, like what I want to chat to you today, a fundamental driver for all this, of course, is climate change. And everyone's aware of climate change these days. We're hearing a lot of it on the news. And look, to be honest, a lot of it can be very overwhelming. It can be very negative. It can be very depressing. The science itself is kind of complex and large, but it can be distilled down into a number of simple elements. Unfortunately, climate change is happening. We know that humans, we are causing it. We know what we need to do. We need to reduce our emissions into the atmosphere, particularly our emissions from fossil fuel, which we use a lot for energy, and particularly our emissions as well from agriculture and land, which is still a significant portion, not the biggest portion, but an important portion as well. What I often find, I'm in a very privileged position working in university. We get paid, we get paid to read the science. I've been at this now for 10 years and more. So I get to look at the full breadth of information and the full depth of knowledge. And, to be honest, what I often find very unsettling about climate change is not the kind of dystopian versions or the apocalyptic versions, but it's just the uncertainty. We really, we're marching into a world that's going to be warmer, and we don't really know with any degree of certainty how bad it's going to be. Unfortunately, we know it's not going to be better. It's going to be bad in many ways. And that's the thing I find kind of most worrying really about climate change, that it could be either a lot worse than what we expect. And it's just that kind of cloud of uncertainty that I find really, really challenging to deal with sometimes. There's no doubt in climate change. In science, we treat doubt and uncertainty differently. Uncertainty means, we know it's going to be warmer by maybe 3 degrees, 4 degrees, or 5 degrees, and we know that that's not good. There's no doubt that it is happening, and there's no doubt that it's going to be very damaging for ecosystems. And and we've all seen these pictures right across our own country and across the world. As the world gets warmer, the atmosphere changes. It leads to more flooding, more extreme weather, and we're starting to see some of this already across Ireland and certainly across parts of the world. So climate change is happening. And I suppose really what the question that we're kind of sitting here today is, what can we do to address this problem and play our part in dealing with it? And of course, it is a global challenge, and that's the challenge really with climate change. It's happening right across the world, and each individual, each family, each community, and each country needs to play its part. I find this graph fascinating. We often show this to our students down in UCC. This is how much energy. What we're looking here, I'm going to show you an animation, and on the bottom you're going to see time, and on the y-axis, the bit going straight up and down, that's how much energy we use. And this is how much energy the world has used for different types, oil and coal and gas, since the 1950s. And what I like to do with my students when we're looking at this, I like to say is, look at the year down the bottom and pick out the year that you were born. Now, if you're born before 1950, I apologize. Just, we usually deal these to students and millennials, they're mainly born around 2000. But if you're born before 1950, your starting point is there. But see when you were born and look how the world has changed since you were born. And let me just run this forward here now. And keep an eye on the top line. There's a couple of lines here, but keep an eye on the top line in particular, because the top line is oil, how much oil we're using in the world. So if you were born around the 1970s, you've seen an almost doubling in oil consumption right across the world. And of course, look at coal, the amount of coal that we use in the atmosphere. And the thing about climate change is that it's actually the cumulative buildup of emissions in our atmosphere is driving all the warming. And if you look at where we started back in the 50s and where we are today, we're talking about a huge amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a heat trapping gas being pumped into our atmosphere, which is very difficult. Now, of course, if you sharp eyes, you'll see there the population is increasing as well. And actually, one begets the other. The increase in fossil fuel, the increase in energy has been very good for many of us on the planet. It has allowed us to increase medical welfare. We have better homes, better food, better use of land. So while it's quite easy to vilify fossil fuels for the damage that they've done to the environment, we must also acknowledge that actually a lot of human development has been built on the back of fossil fuels as well. But going into the future, that must change. And look at the next graph now that I'm going to show you is a kind of a stylized scenario looking at one vision of the future and how this picture needs to change. And it comes from global science. And what we're looking at here is, as we go on, again, we see the picture, we see massive increase in oil, primarily for our homes, primarily for our cars, and we see coal used a lot in electricity generation. And let me just bring on the next slide here now that should coming on. And as we get towards the year 2050, we need a real radical reorientation in how we use fossil fuels in the world. They won't go to zero. We're still going to need fossil fuels for certain things, for trucks and planes and for chemical fertilizers and these things, but the amount of fossil fuel that we'll be using needs to dramatically reduce right across the world, in every country and in every sector. And then what you see, again, from the international science, you see the growth in things like wind energy and solar and bioenergy. And of course, bioenergy is just energy that we grow with very good potential for that in Ireland as well. But we need to see a massive increase in wind energy, in solar energy, and that needs to be associated then with a significant reduction in fossil fuel use. And again, even though this is an international scenario here, the things that we have to do in Ireland are very similar in many regards: reduce fossil fuels and increase clean energy or increase renewable electricity. And of course, and it's not just about energy anymore. It's not just about economics, but like down here in this part of the world, before COVID kicked in, seeing, I suppose, things like the Friday for Futures marches, seeing teenagers and young people getting out and getting very active. So citizens right across the world, right across the country, are seeking action. Like in my area, I find it fascinating. Even just last week, to see what America are doing now. Joe Biden, think what he's talking about in terms of reducing emissions, and even things like China. China coming forward in the last month and talking about reducing emissions. Like 5-10 years ago, those things would have been, inconceivable, from the standpoint where I'm coming. So there's a real, I suppose, social movement. There's a big political movement and an economic movement as well, wrapping itself around the climate action element. And it's certainly not going to be easy. Just because we have a lot of ambition and we have a lot of hope, it doesn't necessarily mean that we take it for granted. There's a lot of difficult choices, and there's a lot of things that we need to understand along the way. But we have a number of pivot movements going on. We've got the science, and now we've got, I suppose, the social element and the citizens element kind of coming in around it as well. And then, of course, last month, I suppose it was March, what do we have now? We've April now. So back in March, the climate bill came into action in Ireland. The climate bill is Ireland's, I suppose, contribution, or Ireland's plan to deal with climate change in Ireland. Ireland has a pretty poor track record, unfortunately, in dealing with climate change. When we stand back and look at our economy, and then we look at all our greenhouse gas emissions, us as Irish citizens would have one of the largest greenhouse gas footprints in Europe. So really, we need to do a lot more about that. And really, what the Climate Action Bill, it's about addressing that. And what the government are planning to do, or are hoping to do over the next 10 years, is reduce all our greenhouse gas emissions by about a half over 10 years. It's going to be remarkably difficult. It's going to be remarkably challenging. No country in the world has ever achieved this before. But it's kind of what's demanded by the science, it's what's demanded by citizens, and it's what's demanded by groups if we really want to avoid that worst element of the uncertainty of climate change. So over the next 10 years and over the next week or two, we're going to hear a lot of it on the radio, on the TV, about the Climate Action Bill and reducing emissions in Ireland. And that brings Ireland in line with where we need to be with the climate science. If you look at Ireland's emissions since the 1990s, like Ireland is quite unusual when we look at other European countries and other global countries. Since the 1990s, in Europe, emissions would have reduced by about a quarter since 1990. In the UK, we're doing incredibly well. In the UK, emissions have reduced by almost 40% since 1990. Ireland, we're still kind of stuck, even 30 years after 1990, we're still pretty much stuck at 1990 levels. We had the boom and the bust, like in 2005, our emissions peak. So the Climate Action Bill is really playing catch up in many regards and trying to get us back on track to our climate obligations and align with the international climate science. So when we stand back and look at emissions in Ireland, greenhouse gas emissions, and remember, greenhouse gas emissions are not just about fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas. So I'm sitting here in my home, my car runs on diesel, my home heating here is on oil. That's responsible actually for the bulk of my emissions in my own personal carbon footprint. And in Ireland, when we stand back, agriculture is a big challenge. 1/3 of our emissions come from agriculture, and agriculture produces these heat-trapping gases as well, mainly from things like cattle belching and the way we manage slurries and the way we manage fertilizers. That's an incredible challenge there as well. But some nice opportunities for agriculture there as well to reorientate towards maybe more profitable sectors as well. And then if we look up in the top left-hand side, kind of what we're talking about today is emissions from the electricity sector. So emissions from electricity are a little bit under 1/5 of all our emissions. So certainly not the full picture, but an important part of the puzzle. And as many of you are aware, what makes electricity so important really is that if you can make electricity clean and green, electricity then can reach further into our communities and into our lives in terms of electric cars or home heating. And of course, all that will come in the future as well. So even though electricity within all the energy that we use today, and if you look around your home, probably electricity is about 1/5 of your actual energy use. But in the future, as we put more plugs on things like cars and home heating, electricity will play a more fundamental role. And that's why it's really important to make it green and to reduce the emissions from that. And of course, there's lots of ways to reduce your emissions, not only from electricity, but from right across the economy. Onshore wind, I live down here in outside Clonakilty. There's about 17 turbines over there on the hill that we can see. Turbines are springing up more across particularly the west coast of Ireland, a little bit more in the Midlands now, and probably moving towards the east then as well. And then we've got this massive offshore potential as well in Ireland. We have very little offshore wind energy in Ireland today. I think we've only one farm to be exact. It's huge potential for onshore and offshore. And then there's other options as well. We can think about our oceans are an incredible resource that could provide lots of energy. It's tricky. We haven't really designed devices that can stay and float out in the ocean for years yet without being damaged. Our oceans are, I suppose, very unforgiving in many ways. And in my institute down here in Mara, I have colleagues doing a lot of thinking around that, trying to produce wind energy devices. And also there's really important stuff around energy that we don't use, saving energy by insulating our homes, using more efficient heating appliances like heat pumps and biomass as well. We have very active weather systems over Ireland, which gives us, a big opportunity to produce, wind and solar and wave energy. But we also have a very good ecosystem for growing energy. It's a lot lower than the electrical resource, but plays an important part there as well. And also within those options and opportunities, beyond electricity, as electricity will allow us to reach deeper into our lives, into our cars, into our homes. And there's also things as well, we can grow energy like sustainable biofuels. And there's a lot of talk in the media and in the news at the moment around things like hydrogen. Many of you will have seen the big announcement by the ESB about 2 weeks ago about converting Money Point over to a place where they can produce hydrogen. Hydrogen is basically like another kind of fuel, but you can generate it from clean, renewable electricity, and it can be used in trucks and cars and everything. So it's really important. And, people ask me often, say, but why wind and why renewable electricity? But, I don't have to tell anyone living up in the Northwest, we have lots of wind in Ireland. We're one of the most windiest places. Ireland and Scotland are these maps here are what we call wind atlases. They show you, how windy an area is really, and it's an incredible resource, I suppose, that blows over our country every day. Of course, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and we need backup, and we need to look at clever ways of getting around that. But in terms of the resource that's there, it's really big. And in terms, when compared to other, places where they're building lots of wind, like Germany, they don't really have a very significant resource. But in Ireland, thankfully, we do, and that's a very a big resource that really hasn't been tapped into in a big way yet in Ireland. And and even simply put, why renewable electricity? But we're actually very good at it in Ireland and the work that EirGrid are doing in some of the universities and UCD around Ireland. They're actually world leaders in this, getting wind energy onto your system that's variable and fluctuating and moves around a lot is actually very difficult. But Ireland has done a really good job, and there was some really nice news there last week about 40% of our electricity now comes from primarily from wind, and that's a good way when we look back 30 years ago when it was almost zero. So why renewable electricity? We have lots of it, and thankfully we're very good at it. So James, I might hand it back to you there now, and maybe over to Robbie. So, but thank you everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that. I think there's a lot of questions coming from that, and I think we'll gather them when we hear all from the three different presenters this morning. So just to kind of keep on time, I'll go to our next speaker, which is Robbie Hearn. Robbie is head of future networks in EirGrid Group and has 15 years experience working in the power industry. I think Seamus gave him a short introduction earlier on. So he is responsible for the delivery of shaping our electricity future roadmap. And he's going to just talk about the options that EirGrid are proposing. So Robbie, over to you.
So look, first of all, thanks very much for the for everyone to take time out of their busy lives to join us here today. Thanks to James, Seamus and Paul for the introductions, and indeed Paul for the really informative presentation, which I think sets the scene really well for the work that we're doing here in EirGrid around what we call shaping our electricity future. So I'm going to give you a quick presentation of the work that we've done. Maybe just to give you a bit of background from where I'm coming from to build on what Paul said. I'm in Dublin today, so again it's raining here today, but look, I have family up from the west of Ireland, and I know, as Paul said, definitely we only get a small smattering of it compared to the west. Just about shaping our electricity future. This is a consultation that EirGrid would have opened in early March, and just to give you an overview of what we do in EirGrid. So EirGrid operate and develop the electricity grid in Ireland. And we bring it from where it's generated by different sources of electricity right around the country and into people's homes, businesses, and indeed communities. I'll just talk to you about what we do in EirGrid. So we're owned by the Irish government, and we're what's called a regulated utility. So effectively, we operate for the benefit of the electricity consumers, all the different types of electricity consumers in Ireland. We don't generate electricity, so we have no vested interest in where generators get built, and indeed we don't make any profit from generators. Our job is to connect those generators into the grid and transport that power around Ireland. We also operate what are called interconnectors with some neighbouring grids. So, for example, we have an interconnector connecting Ireland and Wales. It's called the East-West Interconnector. We also run the electricity market in Ireland, so that's the basis by which all of our electricity bills are formulated, and how we all, I guess, play our part in paying for the electricity industry in the country. We don't own the electricity grid, it has to be said as well, so we don't actually own the physical assets. So for example, whether it's an underground cable or an overhead electricity line. So we've no vested interest in adding to it. It's not like it adds more assets to our balance sheet. Our job is to upgrade and develop the grid in line with government policy. And look, we've a EirGrid working with partnership with all different parties around the country. Look, we've an important role to play to making sure that Ireland has a really high quality electricity supply that delivers for consumers in the country. So how does the grid work? So I'll just take a relatively straightforward example of how power is generated and how it flows around the country and ultimately into people's homes and communities. So on the left-hand side there, for about the last 100 years, power has been generated from fossil fuel sources, so coal, oil, peat and gas. Where we've seen particularly the last 10 or 15 years, a real transition towards renewables. So in Ireland, because of our resources, that's been predominantly onshore wind. But look, we are also now starting to see the advent of solar and indeed offshore wind over the coming decade. That power is generated and EirGrid takes it onto what we call the electricity grid or the transmission grid. And we transport it into all the different corners of the country, out into all the different towns and villages around Ireland. Then ESB networks take it from that grid and they distribute it out into people's individual homes, into businesses, into farms, into large industrial users. So they take the power from the electricity grid and basically transport it out into individual homes. And then at the end of the chain are consumers, and look, the most important part of that chain are the consumers who draw on that power and use it for whatever their needs. So we've shown a graphic here of a residence, someone's home. So for example, to power their homes, washing machines, dishwashers, etc. It's important that whole chain has a really high quality of power for consumers at the end of the day. Ireland traditionally has a very high quality electricity supply measured, and that would be kind of commonly known relative to other jurisdictions. We've a real good quality of electricity supply. So why is electricity a solution to climate change? Well, obviously, as I mentioned there, for about the last 100 years, electricity has been generated from fossil fuel sources, so coal, oil, peat and gas. And unfortunately, they create carbon emissions, which, as Paul so very well put, that creates climate change, leads to things like flooding, and that very huge societal challenge that we're all facing. However, electricity can be generated from clean renewable sources. So this graphic here shows solar and wind. So effectively, we're using the weather to power our homes. And then we can take that and we can use then that electricity to obviously, as I mentioned there, use it for dishwashers, lights, washing machines, etc. But we can also use it to replace fossil fuels and start to use electricity in new ways. So if you think about it, most of our cars at the moment are diesel or petrol. Well, if we can plug that in and use that, power that car from decarbonised electricity, that's a way of decarbonising the electricity sector. Very similar for heating, where we can use, we're really starting to see the growing proliferation of heat pumps, so we can use clean electricity to help heat our homes as well. So Ireland's electricity grid, it's really comes out into all the different corners of the country. This particular graphic here, the red, blue and grey lines, shows our electricity grid and how it gets out into all the different corners of the country. So looking forward, more electricity is going to need to be carried through this electricity grid, which has served us well over the last 100 years. But more electricity grid is now going to need to be carried through it than ever before. So right now, we have about 4,500 megawatts of renewable generation in Ireland. We believe to get to fulfil the government targets of 70% renewables, we're going to need to connect upwards of 10,000 additional megawatts on top of that. Sorry, just get a glass of water there. So that's quite a sizable increase. We're also going to need to take power from where it's generated, which is powered. We're seeing a lot of onshore wind on the west coast. Look, it has to be said, it's in all different parts of the country, but if a lot of it's on the west coast, we expect to see solar kind of predominantly on the south and east coast, and as well offshore. There's a number of mature projects off the east coast. We're really starting to see that space quickly evolve now off the south and west coast as well. So it's about taking all that power and transporting it around the grid to where it's needed. And in the context of Ireland, the dominant load centre where most of our population lives and where there's a lot of demand growth is in the Dublin area. So it's about getting that power out, not just to Dublin as well, it has to be said, to all different parts of the country, but there would be a predominant flow typically into the Dublin area. So to get to 70%, we need to make our electricity grid stronger and more flexible. And really what we mean by that is we need to increase the capacity of the grid so that it can handle the amount of power and all those different flows so that we can deliver on the government targets of 70% by 2030. We, as part of shaping our electricity future, and this is consultation that opened in last March, but to be honest with you, is a project that EirGrid have been working on for around over 12 months prior to that, and indeed have carried out millions of studies to try and understand. We've developed new tools, we've automated things to try and think about, okay, how could and should the grid evolve? We're conscious as well that the development of the electricity grid is a sensitive topic, and we're asking communities to host electricity infrastructure in their area. So to that end, we've proposed 4 different approaches to how the electricity grid could evolve in Ireland. And there are 4 demonstrably different approaches because, look, we want to get people's feedback on their views on the path forward. We believe that the final answer will probably be a blend of the different approaches. And what we're looking to get through feedback as part of this consultation is, look, what's people feedback on the 4 different approaches to help us formulate look, what's the kind of the view forward that best reflects and balances the different views that we seek as part of this process. So the first approach, I'll briefly talk about them. The generation-led approach, that's where we put the generation beside the major load centre. So in the context of Ireland, where we put our generation, offshore generation, there's a number of mature projects off the east coast, going from Dundalk Bay down to North Wexford. Effectively, we government policy would locate them off the east coast, and that power would be pumped directly into Dublin, which is the biggest load centre, and which is the part of the country with the largest expected forecasted growth. The second approach is a developer-led approach, and this is tried and trusted. It's worked really well. That's where developers decide where they want to locate, and then EirGrid would build the grid out to them in order to connect them into the electricity system. Third approach is a technology-led approach. And that's where we use new but proven technologies in order to help us move that clean, renewable electricity across the country using proven technologies, but applying them in different ways onto our electricity grid. And the fourth approach is the demand-led approach. It's very much the opposite of the generation-led approach. So that's where we move some of that demand growth in the Dublin area and look at, okay, what happens if that went out into the different regions of the country where there was large amounts of renewable generation connecting. So effectively, we're moving our demand to where our generation is. It's absolutely crucial to us that we get feedback as part of this process, and that's really the essence of shaping our electricity future. 2030, in the context of electricity projects, that's not a long way away for us. Projects can easily take up to 10 years to build, as you go all through the different cycles of this. And that would be, as you engage with communities, as you seek to get go through the planning process, the construction process, and then the final energization process. It takes time to work through it in the right manner. EirGrid has an important role to play out to 2030, but we're an important cog, but we are just a cog in that wheel as well. And it's really important for us that we go out and engage with developers, with the government, with our regulators, with people who are connected into the grid, members of the public, companies like ESB, to get their view on our thoughts on how the electricity grid could evolve. It's really important. We're at the start of this journey, really. It's 2021 now. 2030 is what, 9-10 years away, and it's it's important to get that feedback now, so we can set off on that journey on the best foot from the start. So the generation-led approach, just to briefly recap on it. So as I mentioned there, in the generation-led approach, you put your generation beside where your demand is. If you can see that little map of Ireland in the bottom right-hand corner, that's where we put, there's a lot of mature offshore projects off the East Coast. They would all connect, we basically pump that power directly into Dublin. And the idea behind that is, if you put your generation beside your demand, like you're using it right where you're locating it right where it's needed. You just have less connectors, less wires connecting the generation to the demand. Sorry, I have a bit of a frog in my throat here this morning. The important point to make here is, okay, first of all, we've about 4,500 megawatts of offshore wind and about 1 gig of solar and inland wind farms in the rest of the country. We require about 38 projects here for the generation-led approach. So why is 38 projects important? Well, we've carried out a deliverability assessment. And we believe we can deliver between 35 and 45 projects by the end of the decade. And that's based on a historical look at how we've done things, and also how do we maintain the integrity of the electricity grid as we undergo this transition from where we are today. We believe that the generation-led approach, we're highly likely to have the electricity grid in place by the end of the decade. In the developer-led approach, that's where developers decide to locate. And again, this is the tried and trusted approach. It served us well as an industry and got us to a scenario today, as Paul said, where 43% of all our electricity comes from renewable sources today. And that's a really impressive number internationally. We looked at, okay, in this scenario, if we had 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, 2 gigawatts of solar, again, obviously onshore, and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. So if the first approach was offshore heavy, in the second approach, it's onshore heavy, just maybe a way of describing it. We need about 77 projects for this particular approach. We don't believe that that number of projects can be delivered and allow us to operate the system in a secure manner until for many years after 2030. However, we wanted to see how could we make the developer-led approach work. So again, we took the same generation portfolio, so 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, 2 gigawatts of solar, and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. We said, okay, let's look at technologies that are out there in different parts of the world and how could we apply them to the electricity grid in Ireland. So for example, we use what are called high voltage direct current cables. So effectively, we would hoover up power in the northwest, so for example in Donegal, and transport it in bulk down into the Dublin area. So you're hoovering it up and just transporting it directly down. Another example is in Mayo, you'd hoover up onshore renewable generation there and transport it down into Moneypoint and then use the 400 kV network, the highest voltage we have, that's an existing network, to transport that power across to around the country and also to the Dublin area. This requires about 46 projects. So challenging, these are complex, they're expensive, but it's certainly a lot better than 77 projects. The fourth approach again takes the same generation portfolio. So it's about 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, 2 gigawatts of solar, and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. But here we have a large pipeline of projects that want to connect in the Dublin area. And look, a lot of them are data centres from large multinational companies who want to locate for different reasons in the Dublin area. But we looked at the scenario, what would happen if some of them connected out into the different regions? So we looked at moving 600 megawatts to Letterkenny, 600 megawatts in total to Letterkenny, Sligo, Galway, Limerick, Cork and Waterford. So moved it out into the different regions. Look where there is a lot of renewable generation as well in this particular scenario. And you can see there was an awful lot of benefit in that. Again, we went to 77 projects. Now we're down to 41, and that's broadly deliverable. But it does require electricity users to locate in preferred locations from an electricity grid perspective. We then looked at the different approaches, and we're conscious this is a complicated question, and 4 different approaches. So we wanted to look at, rather than saying, look, what do people think, we've actually broken it down here by a number, 6 criteria here, and indeed our technical documentation reports, that we even break it down further. But effectively, we look at it through a number of different lenses. So for example, if I take the first one there, about delivering clean electricity 70% by 2030. You can see here, blue scores well, red scores less well. So in the generation-led approach, blue, generation-led has the greatest chance of success, followed by the demand-led, technology-led, and then developer-led. And look, we assess it for a number of different criteria. And really that's to help break down what is a complex question. But it has to be said, the electricity grid, certainly from as part of this consultation, the electricity grid is what people mostly want to engage on. But we also have to be able to operate that electricity grid, a very different electricity grid. We also have to be able to run the electricity market, again, a very different electricity market. And these are also covered in the electricity, in our Shaping Our Electricity Future consultation. I'm not going to go into them as much detail here this morning, but for example, in how we operate the electricity grid, if we have a very different electricity grid, if we have a very different generation portfolio underpinning it, how we operate the system from the control centre, the national control centre, is also going to need to change. We're going to need to have new policies, new tools, new ways of working so that we can continue to operate that system in a secure, reliable manner. It's important that we adapt to that change. Similarly, how we run the electricity market. I guess if you think of fossil fuels on a day-to-day, if you buy a tank of oil, if your home is heated that way, you have to pay for the oil itself. Similarly, if you have a coal generator or a gas generator, you have to pay for the gas and coal. It actually has what's called a variable cost. Obviously, wind and solar, they don't have a variable cost. The wind is free and solar is free. When the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, you can use that to generate electricity. So effectively, we've gone from an electricity market which is focused on kind of the lowest price of fossil fuel, and so that we can keep costs down for consumers, to now a scenario where, for example, there is no, in some or a lot of the time, electricity can be generated with no marginal cost or variable cost. And that's fundamentally changed the market. And it's about doing that in a manner that makes sure that price of electricity is as affordable as possible, but also that developers have, people behind all of these projects have a viable business case. Because if this space doesn't change as well, look, it won't all move forward in tandem. We're very keen to hear people's views. So, for example, we're hosting workshops like this with communities across Ireland. We're reaching out to the different chambers of commerce. Last week we had a really good workshop at the Youth Council of Ireland to make sure we hear that youth voice, which has been so important, like with the Greta Thunberg, and who's really led that very important input into this process on an international scale. And we want to make sure we get it out. What's that feedback from an Ireland perspective? We had an industry forum as well there last week, where we would have spoken to experts in the electricity industry about their views. We're going to hold a civic society forum where we talk to all the different stratas of society and different representative groups to get their views. And then finally, we're going to have what's called a deliberative assembly. So it's kind of like the citizens' assembly that's run by the government, and which, to be fair, have won an awful lot of international praise. So we'll take 99 random people from Ireland and talk them through this particular Shaping Our Electricity Future to get their views on how things evolve. Look, in the Northwest area, we have looking out over the next decade and across the different scenarios in Shaping Our Electricity Future. Certainly, there's a real possibility that onshore wind some is solar as well, but onshore wind in the northwest. Look, it has a really good wind resource. Similarly, we talked about the North Connaught project. That's a project that EirGrid only in the last number of weeks we've been engaging with members of the community for in the northwest for a long time now. But that's where we've started to, I suppose, really flesh out what that project will look like. It's a new 110 kV cable project in the northwest area. We're really looking to get people's views as part of this. So look, we have a consultation portal on our website. Happy to get it via email. But look, we're conscious as well, not everyone is as engaged or is au fait with tech like that. So we're happy to get submissions via post. It's open till the middle of June. And again, that long lead time reflects, look, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We want to give people a chance to input. Look, we're very committed to hearing people's views. We want to hear people's perspectives on this to help us shape our final plan. That's it.
Thanks very much, Robbie, for that very informative presentation. I suppose there's loads of information for people to digest there, and it's great to see EirGrid's commitment, I suppose, to consultation through a number of different channels and that going forward. So, as I said, look, there's been a lot of information thrown at participants today. So just to let people know, the presentations will be available on the Irish Hurling website, and the recording of today will also be available as soon as we can and get it on our website as well. So don't worry about taking loads of notes and stuff like that. We'll be sharing after. So next, I'm going to ask Bill Kelly from Community Power to give a presentation. And Bill is a stalwart of these events now at this stage and has presented at some of the other regions as well. So Bill is going to talk about community power and how communities can become involved in renewable energy. So over to you, Bill, and your screen is working fine there for me anyway.
Great, you can all hear me? Great.
A little bit faint, Bill, if you maybe might go a little bit closer to the microphone, if that's okay.
How's that?
Perfect,
so,
yeah.
Great. So Seamus, James, Paul, Robbie, and indeed everybody, thank you and good morning. So time is of the essence, so I'll press ahead. So our brief agenda: what is community power, who we are. We'll talk about the RES electricity support scheme. We'll talk about renewable energy communities and the future. So community power, we are a community of communities. We operate in the energy generation, energy advocacy, and energy supply sectors, promoting and protecting the interests of community generators. We are 100% community-owned wind, solar, and hydro projects, and with anaerobic digestion and biogas in planning, and we're available at communitypower.ie. We operate in three broad sectors, numerous energy generators, wind and solar primarily. They take the form of limited companies, CLGs, co-ops, and PLCs. And they sell their power into the national grid. We have one energy resale company, and it sells power from the grid to homes, farms, businesses across the country, Cork to Donegal, Galway to Dublin, and indeed all places in between. So, and one representative organisation, a not-for-profit, and it promotes the interests of the community generators to the public, the government, the Department of Climate and Communications, SEAI, the regulator, indeed EirGrid, networks, SEMO, and indeed the EU. And that's very important that our voice is heard at EU level as well. So our primary projects currently include Templederry Wind Farm, operational since 2012, Claremorris Community Solar Farm, successful in last year's first RES auction, Galway Community Renewables near Tuam, also successful in last year's RES auction. We have the resale company, the power resale company, trading as Community Power, and the nationwide not-for-profit CLG representing the interests of the community generators. So very briefly on Templederry, a community initiative. It's where the community power model was conceived and developed. Now it comprises two 2.3 megawatt turbines, 4.6 megawatts in total. That's powering the equivalent of approximately 3,000 average homes. It generates, in terms of financials, one turnover of 1.1 million per annum. It has never been below that. It has frequently been above it. And we are very much of the view that every parish in Ireland should have something similar, be it wind or solar or a combination of both. And Claremorris, then, to have a look there, it is in Claremorris where the community power model began to gain traction, a collaboration between the Claremorris community and Mayo County Council, a 5 megawatt solar facility on a repurposed municipal landfill site. And we're also reintroducing native flora and fauna on that site as well. From conception in 2019 rather, to hopefully production completion in Q4 this year, 3-year start to finish, although COVID may push that to 2022. And here we have Mayo County Council welcoming and congratulating the Claremorris community on their success in the RES auction. Going on to Galway Community Renewables, again, the community power model gaining additional traction. The Barnet Derg Tuam community combining for a 5 megawatt solar facility. Again, 3 years from conception to build out. Hopefully COVID won't push that back. And here we have the chairperson on Zoom to the 120 or 112 rather stakeholders displaying the site map for the solar park. So I also mentioned that we sell electricity. We offer fair, transparent pricing, 1 month rolling contracts. People can leave whenever they wish, no exit fees, although there are annual contracts for commercial and industrial sites. And remember, the money you spend with us, it stays in Ireland to help communities to set up their own energy generation projects. So we would say to people to be the change that you want to see, support your local circular economy. You can sign up online at Community Power /Switch. And also, and we can talk about this in the Q&A later perhaps, the very important function of the resale company, we protect the floor price for community generators when their RES contracts expire in 15 to 20 years' time. So you want to be you don't want to be a price taker, you want to be a price shaper as a generator. So who are we? Who are the people, personnel, and locations? So John Fogarty, whom a lot of you would know, is our MD. Noel Carey is our finance director. Both John and Noel are founding members of not only Community Power, but also Templederry Community Wind Farm. And you have Greg, myself, and Sarah on the ground. And we all work out of Nina. Or I should say, I am the Limerick office, but in close association with Nina. On the back of our success in RES 1, we have the Claremorris office, and quite a lot of you today will know JP Prendergast, who is, I suppose, the public face of the Claremorris project. But JP is working there with a lot of other good folk who brought that project to fruition. And we would hope now, as we work through the RES auctions, that we'll have offices around the country, owned and operated by the generators. So going on from there, we'll now talk about the RES support scheme, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. It's basically a state initiative to incentivize the production of renewable electricity, and it has an auction format. So sealed bids are invited from generators or potential generators for the production of specific amounts of wind and solar electricity. You can also do hydro, but wind and solar are the two main ones, for a specific time, usually for 15 years at a set price. It was introduced in 2020, and it's expected to run in its current format for about five or 6 years. There are 2 sections in the pot, a community section and the developer section, and we are specifically interested in the community section, which is the smaller section. Although it says 1%, which is, in the overall scheme of things, is quite small, but right now at our current state of development, it's fine. So in the community pot, it's 1% of the overall. The maximum size for your project, for an individual project, community project, is 5 megawatts, and the minimum size is 0.5 megawatt. And to put that in perspective, the average home will consume 4.2 megawatts of power in a year. So effectively, you could generate in an hour what a home will consume in a year. So the projects are 100% community owned. And we are working in community power, we're working to increase the size of the community pot from the current 1%. And of course, we would like to think that over time, the communities will grow and develop such that we can compete in the larger pot, but that's for another day. So this slide here, which I'm sharing with you, it's very indicative of the road that we're on. We've borrowed it from a workshop which the Department of Communications Climate Action, which they ran last year, and they singled out Temple-Derry as a very good example of the type of project that they would like to see succeed. Now, they're not suggesting for a moment that it should be identical to Temple-Derry, but at least there's a working model there that other communities can adapt for their own purposes. And as you can see here, the department wants to see a flourishing community of electricity generators. So working on from Temple-Derry, our flagship project, we've been joined now by Claremorris and by Galway, and we hope to continue that into the future. So the steps in the community pot, if you want to develop your own generation facility. Number one, identify a plot of land. Circa 20 acres for a 5 megawatt solar farm, less for a 5 megawatt wind farm. Apply for a grid connection assessment. It will cost you €2,000 plus VAT payable to ESB networks. And what that does for you, it does three things. It puts you in the queue, number one. It gets you a cost for your grid connection and also a timeline. And of course, to do that, you need written approval from the landowner to have the land assessed if the community don't own the land themselves. And ideally have a land lease option with the owner as well. So once you receive your grid connection from networks, you're now in the queue with your grid connection cost and your timeline. And assuming your grid connection cost is reasonable, you can then go ahead and apply for planning permission. And indeed, thereafter, then apply to go into the auction. So to go into the auction, you need the following. You need your grid offer, you need planning permission, your land lease in place, your community cooperative constitution in your legal entity in place, and verified financials. So prepare and submit your bid. Assuming your bid is successful in the auction, you can proceed to contracts and construction. And keep in mind that community power is available to help any and all communities with any and all of these steps. But the important takeaway point from this slide is that you've got to get into the queue with your grid connection offer and cost before you can do anything anything of substance. So that's your first step. Some ideas on financials. Keep in mind now that what I'm showing you is just a helicopter view, right? It's for a solar farm. On the left-hand side, we have the expenditures. And on the top left here, I've highlighted the costs for the grid assessment. And that is to drive home the idea that you're going nowhere until you put that down, get your grid assessment and get in the queue. All the other figures are relatively easy to populate thereafter. Because remember, your grid cost is perhaps the single biggest item that you'll encounter. It will determine whether your project is a stop-go. So, but once you have that, then you can put in all your capital expenditures and a very good estimate of your annual expenditures. And going over then to the other side, you can see the generation output and the potential revenue from it on the solar farm, or indeed wind farm, as the case may be. And you can see in this example here, you've built a capital expenditure of over 3.5 million, total annual expenditure of under half, and then gross income of just under 750,000. And that on the face of it makes very good sense to proceed. But you would have a detailed figures on all aspects of your project ever before you would go into the auction, obviously. So some ideas on shares and funding. Assuming, for argument's sake, you have a build-out cost or a funding requirement of 3 million. I'm just looking at that figure there. It says 0.37 million. It should say 3.7 million on top. But in any event, we've two types of, in our Limerick example, where we're setting up a PLC, community-owned PLC, we're going to issue two types of shares. You have, and I'll run down through them briefly. You'll have the A share and the B share. So the A share confers ownership. It has voting rights, one per person. It's not transferable. We're going to set a price on it of, we think, €1,000. It will pay a dividend, but the board will determine that each year. It does not pay a coupon, and it's targeted towards the locals. Going over then to the B share, it doesn't convey ownership, no voting rights, multiple shares per person. We figure a similar price of €1,000 per share. It does not pay a dividend, but it does pay a fixed coupon for a fixed number of years, and it's targeted at locals and others. So you can see there, by issuing the 300 local shares and 3,000 or 300 A shares and 3,500 B shares, you can easily meet your funding requirement. We expect in Limerick, we expect the call to be oversubscribed. Now, that's in Limerick City. In other rural projects where you may not have, where the population densities would be lower, if there is a funding shortfall, keep in mind that you've got access to the Community Power Green Bond, and it's available to underwrite financially sound, 100% owned community projects. Looking at timelines now, here we have 4 projects. You can see there Templederry took quite a while from conception to construction, from 2000 to 2012 to actually get everything together. That was pre-res. Claremorris and Tuam, you can see there two years, over 2 years to from conception to construction, assuming construction kicks off in September this year, as we expect, COVID notwithstanding. And you can see in the Limerick example, we hope to get that down to 1 year. Now, to put that in perspective, we applied for our grid connection assessment in September. We got our grid assessment last month. And we hope planning permission, everything else in place, assuming we have it in place, to go into the auction later on this year. And as we're talking to the West today, I should say that Corcoran, Ilon Arden, and a number of others will be going into the res auction as well later on this year. But that will give you an idea of the timelines that we strive for. So what was very difficult back in the Templederry pre-res days is now becoming very achievable. So looking at renewable energy communities, it's the generic name for the community that will submit the bid into the auction. It must comply with all the rules as laid down by the department. And the question you should ask yourself is, how will your REC be structured? Who owns what, and how will it be run? So will it have open, voluntary and inclusive membership, transparent in operation, 1 member, 1 vote, meet the res requirements and more, have a constitution that protects against mission drift, have appropriate asset locks as well to protect the community assets. And how does the res auction, the res format framework dovetail with the renewable energy communities? Here are some basic steps. And the important one here that I'm highlighting to you is in red, is to show you that to get your grid assessment, you do not have to have your legal entity set up. Now, once you get it, then you need to set up your legal entity. And of course, there's nothing to stop you setting up your legal entity from day one. But here again, I highlight the importance of getting in the queue to get the plot of land assessed for grid connectivity. The future, as we see it unfolding, in 2012, Templederry on its own. In 2020, joined by Claremorris and Galway in Res 1. In Res 2, in 2021, we have 30 plus communities with whom we're preparing their applications for Res 2. Now, not all of them will make Res 2 because of delayed planning permissions, etc., but the spillover will go into Res 3 the following year. And we would say to communities around the country, Be a part of the alternative economic development model, enriching your communities economically, socially, and culturally while we save the planet. And looking at that graphically, 3 of us in 2020, we expect 10 plus in 2021. We expect that number to double in 2022 and beyond in Res 4. And it's important to point out to people that access to and ownership of the representative organization and the energy resale company, that is optional for each local community generator. Next steps, we would say to you, get in the queue, submit your grid connection assessment. We can do that for you and with you. It costs at €2,500. It is the best feasibility study you will ever commission. We would also say to you, sign up with Community Power for your home, farm, business, be the change you want to see. And finally, when we look at Ardnacrusha, the scheme, the Ardnacrusha hydro scheme in the 1920s, it was transformative for the young state. The Res Community Pot 100 years later in the 2020s, it is transformative for communities around the country in the 2020s. We are already at 15 megawatts capacity and growing, 17% of Ardnacrusha in our first year. This is a golden opportunity for communities around the country to be part of the transition and to generate revenue for themselves with assets that they will own themselves. That's the conclusion of my presentation, and happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks very much, Bill, for your interesting presentation. I've heard it a few times now, and it always strikes me the potential for communities to get involved here. So thanks very much. I'm sure there will be questions on it, and I already see one or two. True. I have a question that came in pre-workshop from someone as well. So I might just go to that, and then I'll go to some of the ones in the chat. And as I said, please, we're a little bit behind now, so we'll take about 5 minutes for questions, if that's okay, and then we'll break into our groups. So I suppose, Paul, the first one is for you, and it's from a John McIntyre in Ballyshannon, who is talking about the hydro station that was built there in the late 40s and 50s, and he is wondering about the potential of hydropower, and he has some negative comments around the damaging impact it has, but I know that a couple of you today mentioned hydropower, so maybe to pick that up and to give us a bit more detail on it, that'd be useful for John's benefit as well.
Yeah, thanks, James. Actually, Bill was mentioning there Ardnacrusha, like back many decades, hydropower played a very important role in producing electricity in Ireland. Today, it's very small, it's about 3%, maybe 4%. And the future, the resource is pretty much saturated in Ireland. So it's not expected to play any large part in the future because we just don't have the sites. And of course, John is correct. Look, anything that needs to be developed, whether it's a hydro project or anything, just needs to be developed sustainably and environmentally correctly. But the future for hydro is very small.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Paul, for that. And I know that you fielded some of the questions in the chat, so thanks very much for that. There's a question here from Joe Sheridan, Galway County Council. I suppose this is probably towards you, Bill, really. Is how do we in local authorities and communities ensure that local transmission grids are upgraded to allow for micro generation, virtual power plants, developer generation that could be placed in our community? So I suppose that goes back to community energy. And I don't know, Robbie, maybe you might want to come in there as well. But Bill, if you want to maybe kick off on that, what can local authorities do, maybe communities do? I think you've outlined a bit of that there as well.
In essence, I would suggest that local authorities should be combining with communities to lobby both the department, the regulator, our good friends in networks and EirGrid to ensure that any upgrades across the country, that anywhere, that a certain portion of each, a certain percentage of each grid upgrade is ring fenced for communities, right? Now that need only be a very small percent in each upgrade, but it would be sufficient for communities to avail of connectivity to the grid. Because remember, if a small village at crossroads like Templederry, if they can generate 1.1 million per annum into their parish in 2 turbines, right? Why shouldn't every village across the country, and indeed bigger areas like ourselves here in Limerick and Claremorris and others have access to the same as well, the same revenue generation capability. So one of our big asks at government level is to have a certain small percentage of any and all grid upgrade ring fence for communities, and we like to partner with local authorities in that endeavour. But that is key. That is key.
Thanks very much. But I suppose Joe also says the communities need to be hard to change, and I think that's something that Irish Link very much agree on. Robbie, do you want to come in that anywhere, I suppose, in terms of connecting these communities to the grid, and I suppose your role in that?
Yeah, look, absolutely, I totally agree. Communities need to be at the heart of this. Like with really interesting presentation from Bill, I have to say, around the different kind of community ownership models that are in existence and projects that are underway. I think, look, when we are looking to develop the grid, when we bring grid into a particular area, whatever the driver may be, it certainly strengthens the electricity supply to that area. It increases the resilience of power into a particular area. I think, look, we're looking to get feedback from, obviously, as through this consultation, but this is a programmatic view. We're talking about many projects. I spoke about 38, 77 projects. We'll obviously engage with each project in a detailed basis with local communities, local authorities, etc., as we look to develop projects once the picture becomes clear following this consultation on the specifics of it. James, am I answering your question though? You were asking me.
Yeah. I suppose EirGrid's role in connecting these communities to the grid, I think you've probably outlined that there as well. Yeah. So look, I think an absolute offshoot of what we do as we develop our grid is we're providing pathways for power onto the electricity grid in Ireland. I think, look, when we looked at shaping our electricity future as well, you mentioned there micro generation. I think the questioner asked that. Look, we've made some, I think at the moment, maybe there's about 50 to 100 megawatts of micro generation in Ireland at the moment. In our projections, we would see potentially up to 400 megawatts by the end of the decade. So that's a very, very significant increase from where we are today. But look, ESB and the SEAI, Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, would be the primary vehicles for connecting the smaller scale projects onto their systems, and ultimately the EirGrid controlled electricity grid. And look, they're doing a lot of engagement with different communities at the moment in that space. Thanks very much, Robbie. Paul, there's one question for you, and we might just take that as the last one for now. I suppose, have you considered the opportunity for micro hydro? I know you've talked about hydro there in general, but micro hydro, because it says Ireland, there is potential for it. Look at the history of mills. I suppose, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, thanks, James. Actually, that saves me my terrible typing out of the response there to Jan. So thanks, Jan, for that question. Look, it's an area, actually, I don't know a lot about small micro hydro, but my sense is that it's small. Like Bill here is talking about, megawatts and gigawatts, and small hydro projects tend to be, local. Now, it doesn't mean they're not a good idea, So I think it has to be explored within the locality, but within the national context, the 70% renewable electricity, even still at a kilowatt or a watt level, the contribution is going to be small, but doesn't mean it's not important. Perfect.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. So look, what we might just do is break into our groups now for about half an hour. I hope everyone can still see me on screen. So I just shared my screen here again. So as we said, we want to make today as interactive as we can. So for the purposes of that, we're going to break everyone into groups just to answer these two questions. Suppose, and to get feedback on the four options that Robbie has outlined already. So, question one, in your opinion, where should new renewable energy generation be located, and what do you believe should determine where renewable electricity is located? Thanks everyone for the breakout rooms. I just was floating around there. There seemed to be a lot of good discussion in them. So, I suppose we just get feedback first of all. I suppose from the two groups, if that's okay. Louise, you turn off your microphone, so I'll go to you first if that's okay, or whoever's feeding back in your group.
Yeah, so we had a very interesting discussion, and I think like a lot of it was about the involvement of communities and community participation, like community ownership as well came up. around not only of energy, but some part of ownership in the grid as well, and that more solidarity needs to happen between communities and the generators of energy, rather than I think the word colonization was used, and like what sources of energy are being used needs to bring benefit, while it can bring more economic activity to the area, it needs to bring as much benefit to the community as well. Just around the design, and I suppose the overhead cables or underhead cables, there was how the DC cable, that if the technology led approach, that doesn't really have much benefit for the communities it's been run through, and it mightn't be, I suppose, the best option. But also around the design of wind farms or solar farms, that the communities need to be involved in the design of it as well. Like, I suppose the height of one wind farm mightn't be the same, it might be different for different areas, and having the community involved in that is important. There was a question about wave energy, just came up there at the end, but it wasn't, I think Robbie had answered it. It's not viable at the moment. Also as well, I suppose one point was about the scale of projects. Like everything, there's always this thinking in Ireland, I think, that everything has to be done on a huge scale. And I suppose adjusting that scale for different areas as well. Like, I suppose in the West, resources that are available in the West should be supporting the people in the West and that kind of thing. I think if there was anything else that came up or I didn't make a point on, if people in the room want to put it in the chat, or just so we get it captured.
Yeah, perfect, Louise. Thanks very much for that. And as Louise says, if there's anything maybe that wasn't captured there, if you want to put it into the chat as well, we are going to record the chat as well. So just for recording that. So if we go to Kate next, Kate, I don't know if it's yourself or someone else from your group is going to feed back, or if you're the messenger.
I'll feed back, James. So we had a good discussion as well, and touched on some of the points that Louise made in terms of, I suppose, what rural Ireland will look like. There's huge changes coming down, and that maybe, the two questions that are being asked, and maybe even the scenarios, are maybe don't capture the complexity of this whole process, and maybe they need to be looked at as well, that to expand it to sort of capture that better. And we had some farmers and representatives from the IFA. So how could farmers get involved in this, that the current structure doesn't maybe seem to allow that, or allow linking into the grid? And equally, in terms of the community projects, how they can connect to the grid. Obviously the upgrades will be ongoing, but what are the opportunities for that in the future, for that kind of micro generation? Because it seems to be something that could expand if it was enabled. And there was a point made as well about what Louise said about bringing the benefits to the areas that the electricity is being generated. So in terms of energy development and local development going hand in hand, and that it could bring, a certain, as Paul mentioned, about very uncertain future that we're facing, and that this kind of community-led and community-generated electricity could potentially bring some stability to communities and sustainability. There was also a comment made just about, I suppose, research and development, and wind turbines in terms of their design, and are they efficient? Is there much research? I'm sure there is a lot of research going on, but is that whole area being developed in terms of research? And there was another comment just about setting proper tariffs and incentives for farmers. So I think that was kind of most of the major points that we looked at. And if there's any specific questions, as Louise said, just pop them in the chat from the group.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kate, for that. We might just give a minute or two for any questions or comments maybe that's come out of the groups if anyone wants to come out. I think from just listening to the responses and kind of floating between the groups, I think it's the importance of communities after coming out very obviously, and bringing community along with these projects or whatever they may be, offshore, onshore, solar power, hydro, whatever kind of electricity we're talking about. It's important to bring community along. And I suppose something that Irish Link has always said is the area consultation. It's no point starting consultation when it's too late, and it needs to be at all stages of projects and so on. So if anyone wants to maybe come in and add to whatever someone said, if they want to put up their hands, that'd be great. We'll try to get in a question or two before we get to 12 o'clock. I know there's a question or kind of a comment there from Patrick as well in the chat around COVID. I suppose is changing things, and I think it was alluded to probably in that wherever the power is coming from, the communities need to benefit from that. There's no point generating the power in the west and dragging and bringing it all to the east, the communities that have the resource need to benefit. Paul, I see your hand up there. Do you want to just come in with a comment or a question?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of saying it just at the end of the last workshop. I guess it's an attitude and an approach towards engaging with communities. My background is community work, and I was just saying in the last group that the idea of bringing communities along, that's you coming, taking their hand and bringing them along, whether they want to or not. Whereas participation in decision making is actually going to give the best results for everyone. Because if communities are involved in the planning stages and they're actually involved in the decision making, then like if it's around their area and it's going to impact on them, then that's direct democracy. Those kinds of participation in decision making will result in the best result where everyone is happy. There's less objections, there's less things slowed down through court appeals. So I guess, yeah, just participation in decision making, and yeah, it's a kind of different approach to consultation where you're just bringing people along with you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul, for that. I think it's a very important point, and I think as you said, consultation and participation are two really different things, and to get communities to participate in this is hugely important in the future. Robbie, do you want to respond maybe to that, I suppose, around the consultation process that that's underway and stuff like that, and kind of maybe respond to that if you want very quickly?
Look, I totally agree with what Paul is saying. I think EirGrid over last year, we did a root and branch view of how we are consulting with communities for how when we look to build projects in different parts of the country. And like we would have said, and look, going back a number of years, it probably wouldn't have been said at the time, but the biggest challenge we face is engaging with communities and social acceptance and an understanding of the projects we're working on. The technical challenges, we've a good track record of it, we'll overcome it, but what's particularly important and what really we need to put our focus on is out there and engaging and talking to communities on the different projects. And that's, I suppose, the idea behind shaping our electricity future. Right now, we're bringing forward 4 different approaches to it. We want to get out there at the very start before we even start to get a sense of a kind of a clearer sense of how things evolve. Right now, when we're 4 different options on how things could evolve, talk to different communities and look to take on board their feedback. And then as we start to hone in on the answer and talk about particular projects, again, going out there and talking to communities, listening to their feedback and taking cognizance of their feedback as we look to design our projects, put forward our planning applications, and indeed through the construction phase as well. So look, it's really important that that public engagement space has to be at the very heart of what we do.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Robbie, for that. If anyone has any more questions or comments, Paul or Bill, just very quickly before I start to thank people and that, do you want to make any closing remarks?
I just could I just have a very quick, just how many people that are representative of the community are actually involved in the decision-making process in EirCom? In other words, at their executive level.
So how we make decisions, Aideen, is we go out, an example of that would be North Connacht. We would go out, we'd run a number of public consultations, we'd run open days, events, we would seek feedback as part of it. And then we look at the particular challenge through a number of different criteria, and then use that to try and come up with, on balance, an answer, and then go out and consult on that. So it's very much a consultative process as we look. So we seek people's feedback, take it on board, and it's not just one. It's not one step. It takes a number of steps, and throughout that, it's important about incorporating feedback from affected communities or whatever the case may be as we go on that journey. Everything is published. It's all very open, and yeah.
John, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to follow up on a question just before you go there. To Bill there, do you think the EirGrid strategy as outlined is suited to community generation in the view of the fact that EirGrid are talking of 40 to 70 projects only? So is it going to be limited to that? Is it enough? And where would you see farmers fitting in? What role can they play there, or how it can be rewarded?
I'd say two things, John. I know EirGrid are organising today's show, but that aside, I have to say hats off to them for bringing the consultation to the public. Now, keep in mind, when they talk about projects, they're talking about the larger scale, right, at the top end. Any community project with 5 megawatts, half a megawatt to 5, we will be connecting into the grid via ESB networks. So think of networks as looking after the roads, and think of EirGrid as looking after the motorways, right? So the community pot, let's say, will never be able to meet the requirements of Ireland going forward, right? We'll only be a portion of it, right? So the crucial thing for us, I would suggest to you, and insofar as that overlaps with your members in the IFA, is that we should be lobbying for, as I say, ring fencing a small portion of any upgrade anywhere, right, across the country, right? Because once it's ring fenced for communities, then you have access to the grid. And I would suggest to you that there is a lot of work to be done there to persuade the department that it is, and the regulator, that it is the right thing to do, right? And that will give communities access to generate the facility to generate power. And like if I take the example of our 30 communities, the 3 of us that are together from Res 1, let's say, and the 30 that are marching in lockstep for Res 2, for the second auction, they're all very energized about the grid, if you'll pardon the pun. But it's to get the word out to the rest of the country that I genuinely believe that never before in the history of the state has an opportunity arisen for communities to generate revenue through assets that they will own themselves collectively, right? It's like the co-op movement on steroids, potentially, you know? And I would say, listen, let's talk offline afterwards about how Community Power and the IFA and the other organisations can bring this to the attention of CRU and the department. And in fairness now to EirGrid, they are talking bigger picture. Those are massive commercial projects that they are talking about developing there. And there's a whole layer underneath that then of smaller projects from like, let's say, our ones which are 5 megawatt in or around that, but smaller developers which would be 5 to 20 megawatt. And then you have the big ones, you know. So it's an opportunity. There's a ready audience there for us. Let's march together. Let's for the benefit of everyone.
So
John, thanks very much. I just add to Bill's point, John. It's when we talk about 70 or 50 projects, that's about, as Bill said, projects on the electricity grid. It's not the number of projects. So whether we can, it's not that we can only have 70 community projects. Yes. It's more about changes to the grid. So yeah, just
perfect. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Robbie.
When the ESB were connecting people to electricity back in the 50s, it was the local business people who went out and persuaded people to take electricity. A lot of them were afraid it had set the house on fire or whatever. Right. And I remember my uncle going out in those days to persuade people to take electricity. It seems amazing, but there you go.
Thanks.
It was community activity, you know?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. I just see the Seamus is after coming in now, and I'm very conscious of the time that we're at 5 past now. So might just thank our 3 speakers, I suppose, Paul, Robbie and Bill, for their contributions today. I think it was invaluable to hear, and there's a lot of good discussion following on from them. And just thank our facilitators and I suppose our note takers in all our different groups. Seamus, do you just want to say something that you're just before we finish?
No, I'd like to again thank all of the speakers, and especially the interjections from the members and people who attended today. I heard the last speaker talking about electricity coming into homes, etc. in Ireland, and in fact I remember that myself. But I suppose the future is very demanding, and I think from what I can gather from the conversations we've heard and seen here this morning, there is a real determination to get this right. But I suppose to get it right at the right cost and in the right atmosphere, and I think that's most important. So James, thanks for handling that. I'll let you have the last word really, because everybody here, I was watching the chat line as well, especially the comments to Bill. So all nice to see the community interest. So James, let me go back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Seamus. I suppose just to say, I suppose this is one in a series of workshops Irish Eurolink is hosting on this consultation process. I suppose our next one is on Thursday, and it's for the North East region. So if you've any colleagues or any friends or family in that area, or maybe people in your own area that weren't able to attend today, please spread the word. And we have ones in the Border region and the Midlands region next week as well. So please engage. And I might just direct people to the EirGrid website and to their consultation portal as well, where you can submit your own individual submissions on it. And as I said, I suppose at the beginning, these consultations that we're doing at the moment are part of a full report that Irish Eurolink will submit to EirGrid on the back of people's feedback in these workshops. So thanks very much for joining us, and hope to see some of you on Thursday again, or maybe some of your colleagues. Thanks very much.